In this brief video presentation, I would like to discuss the topic, there is no behavior unique to lying. People oftentimes associate specific behaviors with deception, such as maybe lack of eye contact. But there are many reasons a person may not maintain eye contact with someone they're talking to that have nothing to do with telling the truth or being deceptive. For example, cultural differences. In this investigator tip, we will address the underlying principles for the proper evaluation of a subject's behavior during the investigative interview. Behavior symptom analysis involves the study of inferences made from observing another person's behavior. This tip addresses behavioral inferences relating to the detection of deception, primarily in a clinical controlled environment. Within the scope of detecting deception, there are two broad inferences that are made through behavioral observations. The first involves the quote-unquote guilt or innocence of the subject. In other words, that the subject commit the act that is under investigation. And the second is inferences regarding the subject's truth or deception. For example, when he says such and such, is that a truthful statement or is he being deceptive? For case-solving purposes, it is important that the investigators appreciate the distinction between those two principles, guilt and lying. For example, consider the following exchange of a homeowner who's being interviewed about his house that has burned down and there is some suspicion that arson was involved. Jimmy, have you ever thought about setting fire to your house for the insurance money? Sure. Everyone thinks about doing something like that. Sure. The suspect verbal response is probably 100% truthful. Yet the content of the response would strongly suggest possible guilt with respect to setting his house on fire. Research in the field of behavior symptom analysis generally indicates higher accuracy in identifying quote-unquote guilt or innocence rather than just simply truth or deception. To appreciate the nature of these inferences, it has to be realized that communication occurs on three distinctly different channels. The first, of course, is the verbal channel, which are the words that are spoken and the arrangement of those words to send a particular message. Paralinguistic behaviors, which are aspects of speech outside of the words themselves, tone of voice, speech latency, how long it takes the person to respond, speech rate, etc. And then, of course, the nonverbal channel, physical movements, posture changes, eye contact, facial expressions, etc. When evaluating a subject's behavior in terms of deception, there are 5 essential principles that have to be followed in order to increase the probability that our inferences will be accurate. If we fail to follow all of these 5 principles, the probability of making erroneous inferences is substantially increased. Number 1, understand that there are no unique behaviors associated with truthfulness or deception. The behavioral observations an investigator makes of a suspect do not specifically correlate with truth or deception, but rather they reflect the subject's internal emotional state, cognitive processes, and internal physiological arousal experienced during the response. The emotional states most often associated with deception are fear, anger, embarrassment, indignation, and maybe even hope. The cognitive processes may reveal concern, helpfulness, and confidence on the one hand versus offering unrealistic explanations for the crime, being defensive or overly polite on the other. There are also internal physiological responses that cause external behavioral responses, such as a dry throat, skin blanching, pupillary dilation, or blushing. Observed in isolation, certainly none of these behaviors should cause an investigator to conclude the subject is telling the truth or lying. Secondly, it is important to evaluate the consistency between all 3 channels of communication. When a suspect sends behavioral messages that are consistent within all 3 channels, the investigator can be very confident in the assessment of the credibility of the subject's response. However, when there are inconsistencies between the channels of communication, the investigator needs to evaluate the possible reasons for those inconsistencies. Thirdly, It's important to evaluate paralinguistic and nonverbal behavior in the context of the subject's verbal message. When assessing the probable meaning of a subject's emotional state, the subject's paralinguistic and nonverbal behaviors must always be considered in the context of the verbal message. Consider the following two examples. In the first instance, the subject was asked, Mike, have you ever been questioned before concerning theft from an employer? And Mike said, well, yeah, about 2 years ago, I worked at a hardware store. They had an inventory shortage, so all employees were questioned, and there were some things I took from there. While he was giving us that answer, he had crossed his legs, looked down to the floor, and dusted his shirt sleeve. In the second instance, the subject was asked, Joe, did you steal that missing $2,500? No, I did not. And while he gave us his answer, he was crossing his legs, looking down at the floor, and dusting his shirt sleeve. The two subjects displayed identical paralinguistic and nonverbal behaviors during their responses. However, the interpretation of the behaviors is completely different. In the first example, the subject is completely truthful when he admits stealing from his prior employer, but he feels embarrassed and possibly even threatened by revealing the prior theft. In the second example, the verbal content of the subject's response does not explain the accompanying nonverbal behaviors. So the investigator might begin to consider these behaviors as reflecting possible fear or conflicting emotional states that would not be considered appropriate from a truthful subject given the content of the response, the out-and-out denial. We always have to evaluate the preponderance of behaviors throughout the interview. One of the findings learned through research is the importance of rendering opinions based on evaluating the subject's behavior throughout the course of the entire interview. When evaluators in research studies were asked to make a decision based on a single interview question and answer, they were considerably less accurate than when they were able to look at all of the interview answers and questions as a total. Similarly, the confidence of an investigator to make a behavioral assessment of a subject's credibility in a 5-minute interview will be considerably less than if the behavioral assessment was made over a 30 to 40-minute interview. The fifth guiding principle is that we always have to establish the subject's normal behavioral pattern. Everybody is unique. Everybody has their own mannerisms, the way they speak, the way they maintain eye contact with someone. And there are certainly non-deceptive reasons that a subject might exhibit poor eye contact or respond to a question very quickly or very slowly, yawn, clear their throat, or engage in other nonverbal behaviors. So before any of these behaviors can be considered a criteria of deception, the investigator first must establish the subject's behavioral norm or baseline. At the outset of every interview, we should engage in non-threatening conversation, casual conversation, gathering biographical information, possibly talking to the subject about a job or what he does for a career, so as to establish their normal behavioral baseline. So that later in the interview, when we begin talking about the issue under investigation, such as using the stolen credit cards, we see those behaviors change, the change may become significant. In addition to these 5 principles, it is important to evaluate verbal behavior in context. Deceptive subjects oftentimes use stalling tactics to give themselves a few seconds to decide how they want to answer a question. And one of the stalling tactics that they might use is to ask the interviewer to repeat the question. For example, Charlie, did you set fire to that building? I'm sorry, what are you asking me? Now, if that interview had taken place on the phone, the telephone, we could not have placed any significance on the fact the subject asked for the question to be repeated because we don't know if at that moment when we asked the question he was distracted by someone talking to him or a phone ringing in his office, whatever it might be. And so he may not have actually heard the full question. So for him to ask that be repeated is completely reasonable. Whereas when we were face to face with the subject and he asked for the question to be repeated, we know there was no interruption, no distraction, and there was actually no reason for him to ask for the question to be repeated on the face of it. Another example of the importance of viewing behaviors in context is the response, I don't know. If I were to ask you what you did 4 weeks ago on Wednesday night, it would be completely reasonable for you to say, I don't know. If I asked you if you had anything to do with killing your next door neighbor last night, and you go, I don't know, that's a whole different ballgame. Context is critical in the evaluation of behavior. The evaluation of a subject's behavior for indications of truth and deception is a complicated endeavor and should be considered only as one factor in the assessment of the subject's possible involvement in committing the issue under investigation. For additional information on the evaluation of a subject's verbal, nonverbal, and paralinguistic behaviors and the principles to follow in making such an assessment, we would encourage you to go to our website at reid.com and read through some of our investigator tips which discuss these specific issues, as well as our book, Criminal Interrogation and Confessions. Thank you very much for spending a few minutes reviewing this video presentation.